The fluorescent lights in Dr. Martinez's office hummed with a frequency that made Sarah's hollow stomach vibrate. At 11 years old, she had learned that hunger wasn't just an empty feeling. It was a living thing that clawed at your insides, made your hands shake, and turned the world into a series of dizzy spells punctuated by the constant ache of wanting something you couldn't name. Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work. So if you are enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel. Sarah, can you step on the scale for me? Dr. Martinez's voice carried that gentle authority that all pediatricians seem to possess, but there was something different today. Something sharper beneath the kindness. Sarah's bare feet touched the cold metal platform, and she watched the numbers dance before settling on a figure that made the doctor's pen pause mid-stroke across her chart. 63 pounds. The same weight she'd been 6 months ago. The same weight she'd been a year ago, when she should have been growing, stretching toward the sky like the sunflowers her grandmother used to plant behind the old farmhouse where Sarah spent summers. That felt like distant dreams now. Has Sarah been eating well at home? Dr. Martinez asked, her eyes meeting Sarah's father's with an intensity that made the small examination room feel even smaller. David Chen shifted in the plastic chair, his work shirt still carrying the smell of motor oil and frustration from another 12-hour day at the automotive shop. He ran thick fingers through his graying hair, a gesture Sarah had come to recognize as the precursor to one of his explanations. She's always been a picky eater, Doc. You know how kids are. His voice carried that tired edge it always held when discussing Sarah's quirks, as he called them. My wife, Elena, she tries everything, making her favorite foods, sitting with her during meals. But Sarah she doesn't eat much. Never has. Sarah's fingernails dug into the paper covering the examination table, creating tiny crescent moons in the white surface. The lie sat between them like a living thing, breathing and growing with each passing second. She wanted to speak, wanted to tell Dr. Martinez about the locked refrigerator, about the cabinet doors sealed with child-proof latches that weren't meant for children, about the breakfast that consisted of watching her younger brother Tommy eat pancakes while she received a single piece of dry toast that Elena would snatch away if Sarah didn't finish it fast enough. But silence had become her second language, fluent and familiar. Speaking meant questions, and questions meant Elena's special brand of creativity when it came to punishment. The basement, the locked bedroom, the long, cold nights listening to her stomach sing its hollow song while the rest of the family enjoyed dinner upstairs. Dr. Martinez's examination was thorough in ways that previous checkups had never been. She pressed her stethoscope against Sarah's chest and listened not just to her heartbeat, but to the spaces between beats. She examined Sarah's fingernails, brittle and ridged like old tree bark, and ran her fingers through Sarah's hair, noting how it came away in her hands like autumn leaves. Sarah, I want you to tell me about what you ate yesterday, Dr. Martinez said, pulling up a chair so she could sit at eye level with the girl. Start with breakfast and tell me everything. The question hung in the air like smoke. Sarah's eyes darted to her father, who was checking his watch and sighing in that particular way that meant he had somewhere more important to be. She thought about yesterday morning, about waking up to the smell of bacon and eggs that Tommy and Elena shared while she watched through the kitchen doorway, having been told that breakfast wasn't ready for her yet. It never became ready. By the time Elena declared the kitchen closed, Sarah had learned not to ask. I had cereal, Sarah whispered, the lie tasting like copper in her mouth. And for lunch, I had a sandwich. Another lie. Lunch had been Elena holding up a peanut butter sandwich, asking Sarah if she really deserved it after being difficult that morning by asking for a glass of water before school. Dr. Martinez made notes, her pen scratching against paper with increasing urgency. And dinner? Spaghetti. The biggest lie of all. Dinner had been watching through the crack in her bedroom door as the family ate Elena's famous marinara sauce, while Sarah lay on her bed, pressing her face into her pillow to muffle the sound of her stomach's protests. Tommy, who was 8 and blessed with Elena's easy laugh and David's broad shoulders, had started asking questions lately. "Why doesn't Sara eat with us anymore?" he'd asked 2 nights ago, his voice carrying through the thin walls of their modest 2-story house on Maple Street. Elena's answer had been swift and practiced. "Sara is learning to appreciate food, baby. Some children need to understand that eating is a privilege, not a right." The conversation had ended there, as most conversations about Sara did in the Chen household. Tommy was young enough to accept Elena's explanations, old enough to sense that something wasn't quite right, but not old enough to understand the careful architecture of control that Elena had built around Sara's life. Dr. Martinez finished her examination and stepped outside the room, leaving Sara alone with her father for the first time in weeks. David looked at his daughter with eyes that held equal parts love and exhaustion, and Sara wondered if he truly couldn't see what was happening, or if seeing it would require him to do something about it, something that might disrupt the careful balance he'd struck with his second wife. Elena had come into their lives 3 years ago, 6 months after Sara's mother, Linda, died in the car accident that split Sara's world into before and after. Elena arrived like a summer storm, sudden, intense, and transforming everything in her path. She was beautiful in the way that made people stop and stare, with dark hair that caught light like spun silk, and a smile that could charm anyone she met. She brought laughter back to their house, brought order to David's chaos, and brought a new kind of attention to Sara that felt both suffocating and strangely addictive. At first, Elena's rules had seemed reasonable. Bedtimes became more structured. Chores were assigned and completed. The house, which had fallen into comfortable disarray after Linda's death, began to sparkle under Elena's careful attention. Sara had been grateful for the structure, for someone who seemed to care about the details of daily life that David, in his grief, had let slide. But structure had gradually become control, and control had slowly transformed into something darker. It started with Elena suggesting that Sara might eat too much, that maybe she should learn to appreciate food more by having less of it. "Gratitude," Elena would say, her voice honey-sweet and reasonable, "comes from understanding scarcity." The locked refrigerator had appeared first, then the cabinet latches, then the new rule that Sara couldn't eat without Elena's direct supervision. Some children, Elena explained to David during one of their quiet evening conversations that Sara overheard from the top of the stairs, need more guidance than others. Sara's been through trauma. She needs structure to feel safe. David had accepted this explanation with the relief of a man who desperately wanted someone else to understand his complicated daughter. Sara's grief had been messy and inconvenient, full of tears at inappropriate times and questions about her mother that left him fumbling for answers he didn't have. Elena offered solutions wrapped in psychological terminology that sounded professional and caring. She spoke of childhood development and trauma responses with the confidence of someone who had read articles and watched documentaries, and David had been grateful to trust her expertise. But Sara remembered her mother, remembered Linda's approach to difficult days and complicated feelings. Linda had believed in talking through problems, in sitting together at the kitchen table over cups of hot chocolate while they worked through whatever was troubling Sara's young heart. Linda had never believed that punishment should involve withholding. Basic needs had never suggested that love should be conditional on perfect behavior. The examination room door opened, and Dr. Martinez returned with a social worker Sara had never seen before. A tall woman with kind eyes and a gentle smile, who introduced herself as Mrs. Patterson. Sara's father straightened in his chair, his expression shifting from tired patience to wariness. "Mr. Chen, I'd like to discuss some concerns about Sara's physical condition," Dr. Martinez began, her voice carefully neutral. "Her weight hasn't increased in over a year, despite her age and expected growth patterns. She's showing signs of malnutrition, brittle nails, hair loss, fatigue, and some concerning blood work results from today's visit." The words hung in the air like a challenge. Sara watched her father's face cycle through confusion, defensive anger, and something that Might have been recognition. His hands clenched and unclenched in his lap, a nervous habit Sara had inherited. "I don't understand," he said finally. "Elena feeds her. She makes meals, sits with her, encourages her to eat. She's been a difficult eater since her mother died. It's emotional, you know? Trauma response." Mrs. Patterson leaned forward slightly, her voice gentle but insistent. "Mr. Chen, we'd like to have a conversation with Sara privately, if that's all right. Sometimes children find it easier to discuss sensitive topics when they feel completely safe to do so." Sara's heart began to beat faster, a wild rhythm that seemed to echo in her ears. The moment stretched before her like a bridge she could choose to cross or burn. On one side lay the familiar territory of silence, of keeping Elena's secrets, of maintaining the careful balance that kept their family unit intact. On the other side lay the unknown, words that couldn't be taken back, consequences she couldn't predict, changes that might make everything better, or might destroy what remained of the life she knew. In her lap, Sara's hands found the small wooden butterfly her mother had given her years ago, a smooth piece of carved cherry wood that Linda had pressed into Sara's palm during one of their last conversations before the accident. "This is for when you need to remember that you're brave," Linda had whispered. "Even when you don't feel brave, especially then." Sara's fingers traced the butterfly's delicate wings, worn smooth by years of worried handling. The room felt suspended, in time, waiting for her decision, waiting for her voice to break the silence that had protected and imprisoned her in equal measure. In that moment, with Dr. Martinez's concerned eyes on her and Mrs. Patterson's encouraging smile, Sara realized that silence itself had become a kind of starvation, not just of her body, but of her spirit, her truth, her fundamental right to be seen and heard and cared for. The butterfly felt warm in her palm, as if it were alive, as if her mother's love could still reach across the space between then and now to give her courage. Sara looked up and met Dr. Martinez's eyes, and for the first time in months, she opened her mouth not to lie, but to speak her truth. "I'd like to speak with Sara alone, if that's all right," Mrs. Patterson repeated, her voice carrying a warmth that Sara hadn't experienced in months. David hesitated, glancing at his watch again, but nodded reluctantly. After he left, the room felt both larger and more intimate, as if the walls had stepped back to give Sara's words room to breathe. Dr. Martinez pulled her chair closer to the examination table where Sara sat, her small frame dwarfed by the sterile, medical equipment surrounding them. "Sara, you're safe here," she said simply. "Whatever you tell us stays between us unless you're in immediate danger. Do you understand?" Sara nodded, her throat tight with the effort of holding back 3 years' worth of words. Mrs. Patterson had positioned herself near the door, not blocking it, but creating what felt like a protective barrier between Sara and the outside world, where her father waited and where Elena would be expecting her report on how the appointment had gone. "Can you tell us what you really ate yesterday?" Dr. Martinez asked gently. The question cracked something open inside Sara's chest. She thought about lying again, about maintaining the careful fiction that had kept their family functioning, but the butterfly in her palm seemed to pulse with warmth, and she remembered her mother's voice. "Truth is like water, sweetheart. It always finds a way through." "I didn't eat anything yesterday," Sara whispered, her voice so quiet that both women leaned forward to hear her. "Elena said I wasn't grateful enough for Monday's dinner, so I wasn't allowed to eat on Tuesday." The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was full of understanding, of professional concern clicking into place, of 2 adults finally hearing what they had suspected but hoped wasn't true. Dr. Martinez's pen had stopped moving entirely, and Mrs. Patterson's gentle expression had sharpened into something more focused. "What about the day before?" Mrs. Patterson asked softly. Sarah's memory of the past weeks blurred together into a landscape of empty plates and locked cabinets, but Monday stood out clearly because it had been different. Tommy had asked Elena why Sara couldn't eat with them, and Elena had decided to make a point. On Monday, Elena made my favorite dinner, mac and cheese with cut-up hot dogs. She put a plate in front of me and told me I had 5 minutes to eat it all. Sarah's fingers tightened around the butterfly. But she only gave me a teaspoon to eat with, and when I couldn't finish it fast enough, she said I was being dramatic and took the plate away. She told Dad I'd refused to eat. Dr. Martinez exchanged a look with Mrs. Patterson that Sara recognized. It was the same look adults shared when they thought children weren't paying attention, full of communication that happened in the space between words. "How often does this happen, Sara?" Dr. Martinez asked. "The not eating." Sara tried to count the days, but they had become a blur of hunger and careful calculations. "Most days," she said finally. "Elena says some kids need to learn appreciation. She says I eat too much, and that's why Dad has to work so hard. She says my mom would be disappointed in how ungrateful I am." The mention of her mother made Sarah's chest ache in a different way than hunger did. Elena had never known Linda, but she spoke about her with the confidence of someone who had been there, who understood what Linda would have wanted for Sara. It was one of the cruelest aspects of Elena's control, the way she weaponized Sarah's love for her dead mother, turning Linda's memory into another tool for manipulation. "Tell me about the locks," Mrs. Patterson said gently. "On the refrigerator and cabinets." Sara looked up in surprise. She hadn't mentioned the locks, but Mrs. Patterson smiled encouragingly. "I've seen this before, honey. It's okay to tell us." "Elena says they're for my own good," Sara began, her voice gaining strength as she realized that these adults believed her. "She says some children can't control themselves around food, so they need external controls to help them learn discipline. She put them on about a year ago, after she caught me trying to get a glass of water from the kitchen at night." The memory of that night was seared into Sara's mind with perfect clarity. She had woken up desperately thirsty, her mouth dry as cotton from another day of limited fluids. Elena controlled access to water too, claiming that Sara would wet the bed if she drank too much. Sara had crept downstairs in her pajamas, trying not to wake anyone, and had been reaching for a cup when the kitchen light blazed on. "What are you doing?" Elena's voice had been sharp with anger, and Sara had jumped so hard she'd dropped the cup, watching it shatter across the kitchen floor. "You know you're not allowed in here without permission." "I was just thirsty," Sara had whispered, but Elena was already moving, grabbing Sara by the arm and marching her upstairs. "This is exactly what I'm talking about," Elena had hissed as she pushed Sara into her bedroom. "No self-control, no respect for rules. Tomorrow we're getting locks, and you're going to learn that food and water are privileges, not rights." The locks had appeared the next day, heavy industrial things that turned their cheerful yellow kitchen into something that felt more like a fortress. Elena had presented them to David as a child-proofing measure. "Sara's been getting into things. At night," she'd explained. "It's not safe for her to have unsupervised access. The pediatrician recommended it," she'd added, a lie so smooth and confident that David had accepted it without question. "Does your father know about the locks?" Dr. Martinez asked. Sara nodded slowly. "Elena told him they were to keep me safe. She said I have a disorder that makes me eat too much when no one's watching, and that the locks would help me learn self-control." It was brilliant in its way. Elena had taken Sara's desperate attempts to find food and water and reframed them as evidence of a psychological problem that required her intervention. When David came home from work to find Sara crying from hunger, Elena would explain that Sara was testing boundaries or seeking attention. She spoke with such authority about childhood psychology that David had begun to doubt his own instincts about his daughter. "What happens when you ask for food?" Mrs. Patterson asked. Sara thought about the careful negotiations that had become her daily reality. "I have to wait for Elena to decide if I deserve it. She makes me list 3 things I'm grateful for, and then she decides if I sounded sincere enough. If she doesn't think I mean it, I have to wait longer. The gratitude game had evolved over months, becoming more complex and humiliating each time Elena refined the rules. At first, Sara had been able to satisfy the requirements easily. She was grateful for her home, for her family, for her stuffed animals. But Elena's standards had grown increasingly impossible to meet. Sara's tone wasn't right, or her examples weren't specific enough, or she was taking too long to think of answers. Sometimes she makes me write essays about gratitude, Sara continued, remembering the hours spent hunched over her small desk, trying to find new ways to express appreciation while her stomach cramped with hunger. 500 words about why I don't deserve food or why I should be thankful for less. If there are spelling mistakes, I have to start over. Dr. Martinez's pen had begun moving again, filling pages with notes that Sara couldn't read, but that looked urgent and important. Mrs. Patterson had pulled out a phone and was typing quickly, her expression growing more serious with each of Sara's revelations. "What about school?" Dr. Martinez asked. "Do you eat lunch there?" Sara shook her head. "Elena packs my lunch, but it's usually empty. She puts a note in the lunchbox that says I'm on a special diet for medical reasons, and I'm not supposed to eat at school. My teacher, Mrs. Rodriguez, asked about it once, and Elena came to school to explain that I have eating issues and that the school shouldn't interfere with my treatment." The school visit had been masterfully executed. Elena had arrived dressed professionally, carrying a folder full of printouts about childhood eating disorders and official-looking documents that weren't quite medical records, but resembled them enough to be convincing. She had spoken with such authority about Sara's condition that Mrs. Rodriguez had apologized for overstepping and promised not to interfere with Sara's dietary restrictions. "Elena volunteers at the school sometimes," Sara added quietly. "Everyone likes her. She brings cupcakes for class parties and helps with fundraisers. She tells people she's worried about me, that I'm struggling since my mom died, and that she's doing everything she can to help me heal." This was perhaps the most insidious aspect of Elena's control, the way she had woven herself into the fabric of Sara's world, becoming not just her stepmother, but her advocate, her protector, the adult who understood her best. To the outside world, Elena appeared to be exactly what David and Sara needed. A caring woman who had taken on the challenging task of helping a traumatized child heal from loss. But Sara lived with the private version of Elena, the one who emerged when they were alone together. That Elena was calculating and cold, someone who seemed to take genuine pleasure in Sara's desperation and confusion. That Elena would hold up a sandwich and ask Sara to beg for it, then eat it herself while explaining that Sara's begging hadn't been sincere enough. That Elena would wake Sara up in the middle of the night to clean imaginary messes or complete punishments for infractions Sara couldn't remember committing. "Tell me about your relationship with Elena," Mrs. Patterson said gently. "How does she treat you when your father isn't around?" Sara's hands shook as she reached for words to describe something she had never articulated, not even to herself. "She says she loves me, but it's different from how she loves Tommy. She says Tommy is easy to love because he's grateful and obedient, but I'm challenging. She says love has to be earned, and I haven't earned hers yet." The concept of conditional love had been introduced gradually, so subtly that Sara hadn't recognized it as abuse. Elena would often begin conversations with, "I want to love you the way I love Tommy, but..." and then detail Sara's failures, her ingratitude, her resistance to Elena's help. She framed her cruelty as disappointment, her control as caring, her punishment as natural consequences for Sara's poor choices. "She has special names for me," Sara continued, her voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "When it's just us, she calls me ungrateful girl or burden child. She says these names with love, like they're pet names, but they don't feel good." Dr. Martinez's jaw had tightened almost imperceptibly, but her voice remained gentle when she asked, "Does Elena ever hurt you physically, Sara?" Sara thought about the question carefully. Elena was too smart for obvious physical abuse. She never left marks, never did anything that would be visible to David or to teachers. But her touches were calculated to cause maximum psychological impact with minimal physical evidence. She grabs my arms sometimes, but not hard enough to leave bruises, Sara said slowly. And she has a game where she'll hold food close to my face so I can smell it, then pull it away when I try to take a bite. She says it's to teach me patience, but it makes me feel crazy. The food teasing had become one of Elena's favorite tactics. She would prepare elaborate meals while Sara sat at the kitchen table, describing each ingredient in detail, letting Sara smell the aromas, asking her to guess what they were having for dinner. Then she would serve David and Tommy their portions, while Sara watched, explaining that Sara's portion was still being prepared, or that Sara needed to complete some task before she could eat. By the time Sara was allowed to approach the table, the food would be gone, and Elena would express surprise that Sara was still hungry. She also likes to test my memory, Sara added. She'll tell me I said something I didn't say, or did something I didn't do, and when I try to explain that I didn't, she says I'm lying. She says trauma makes children forget things, and that I can't trust my own memory. This gaslighting had been perhaps the most devastating aspect of Elena's psychological campaign. She would systematically undermine Sara's sense of reality, insisting that conversations had gone differently than Sara remembered, that agreements had been made that Sara had forgotten, that punishments were the result of behaviors Sara couldn't recall. Over time, Sara had begun to doubt her own experiences, to question whether her memories were reliable, to accept Elena's version of events even when it contradicted her own clear recollections. Mrs. Patterson and Dr. Martinez exchanged another, significant look, and Sara realized that she had been talking for a long time, that words had been pouring out of her like water through a broken dam. She felt simultaneously relieved and terrified. Relieved to finally have adults who believed her, terrified of what would happen when Elena discovered that Sara had broken their family's most important rule. What happens at home stays at home. Sara, you've been incredibly brave today, Dr. Martinez said, reaching over to gently touch Sara's hand. What you've told us helps us understand what's been happening, and we want you to know that none of this is your fault. Not the hunger, not the locks, not any of it. The words hit Sara with unexpected force. In all the months of carefully managing Elena's moods and trying to earn her approval, Sara had internalized the message that her suffering was somehow her own fault, that she was too difficult, too ungrateful, too damaged from her mother's death to deserve normal treatment. Hearing an adult explicitly state that she wasn't to blame felt like being given permission to breathe again. What happens now? Sara asked, her voice small but steady. Mrs. Patterson smiled, and there was something fierce and protective in her expression. Now we make sure you're safe, she said simply. We're going to need to have some conversations with your father, and with Elena, and there will probably be some changes at home. But I want you to remember that telling the truth today was exactly the right thing to do. Sara nodded, clutching her mother's butterfly so tightly that she could feel its wooden wings cutting into her palm. Through the examination room window, she could see her father pacing in the waiting area, checking his phone, probably texting Elena to let her know the appointment was running long. In a few hours, Elena would expect her full report on everything that had happened, and Sara would have to decide whether to lie about this conversation or to face the consequences of having spoken her truth. But for the first time in months, Sara didn't feel completely alone. She had been heard, believed, and protected by adults whose job it was to keep children safe. Whatever came next, she wouldn't have to face it in silence. The examination room. Door opened, and Sara's father stepped back inside, his expression tense with worry and impatience. "Is everything okay?" he asked, looking between Sara and the two women who had just heard his daughter's story of systematic starvation and psychological abuse. Dr. Martinez stood up, her professional mask firmly in place. Mr. Chen, we need to have a serious conversation about Sarah's health and home environment. Would you please have a seat? David Chen had always prided himself on being a good father, but as he settled back into the plastic chair in Dr. Martinez's office, he felt the familiar weight of inadequacy settling over his shoulders like a heavy coat. His daughter sat on the examination table looking smaller than ever, her dark eyes holding secrets he was only beginning to understand he should have been asking about. Mr. Chen, Dr. Martinez began, her voice carrying a gravity that made David's chest tighten. Sarah has shared some concerning information about her eating patterns and home environment. I need to ask you some direct questions, and I need honest answers. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, and David became acutely aware of the smell of antiseptic and the way his daughter's eyes avoided meeting his. Something cold began to spread through his stomach, a creeping realization that the conversation he'd expected about picky eating and growth charts was about to become something much more serious. When was the last time you personally witnessed Sarah eat a complete meal? Dr. Martinez asked. David opened his mouth to answer, then closed it again. When had he last seen Sarah eat? Really eat, not just push food around on her plate or take a few bites before excusing herself from the table. He worked 12-hour days at the automotive shop, often leaving before Sarah woke up, and returning home after dinner had been cleaned up. Elena always had updates about Sarah's eating, how she'd refused lunch or eaten only half her breakfast, or claimed she wasn't hungry at dinner. Elena handles most of the meals, he said slowly. I trust her judgment. She tells me Sarah's been difficult about food, and I see her being difficult about other things, so it makes sense. Mrs. Patterson leaned forward slightly. What do you mean by difficult about other things? David thought about the mornings when he'd find Sarah crying in her bedroom, and Elena would explain that Sarah had been acting out, testing boundaries, seeking attention in unhealthy ways. Elena had read books about childhood trauma and grief counseling. She spoke with authority about Sarah's behavior patterns and emotional needs. She had convinced him that Sarah's resistance to structure was a symptom of unresolved grief, and that firmness and consistency would help her heal. Since her mother died, Sarah's been challenging, David said, the word feeling insufficient and wrong as soon as he spoke it. Elena says she needs structure, that trauma makes children push against the people trying to help them. Sarah fights. Bedtime, doesn't want to do chores. Complains about Elena's rules. Elena's been working with her on gratitude and responsibility. As he spoke, David watched his daughter's face crumple slightly, and he felt a stab of uncertainty. Sarah hadn't always been challenging. Before Elena, before the rules and the structure, and the constant reports of behavioral problems, Sarah had been a quiet, thoughtful child who helped with household tasks without being asked, and rarely gave him trouble. When had that changed? And why hadn't he questioned the timing more carefully? Mr. Chen, Dr. Martinez said gently, when you come home from work and Sarah isn't eating dinner with the family, what explanation does Elena give you? She says Sarah already ate, or that Sarah refused dinner, or that she's being punished for something that happened during the day. David's voice grew quieter as he spoke. Elena always has a reason. Sarah's been ungrateful or disrespectful, or she broke something, or she didn't do her chores properly. Mrs. Patterson pulled out a notepad. How often does Sarah eat dinner? With your family? David tried to remember the last family dinner that had included Sarah, and the realization hit him like a physical blow. He couldn't remember one. Not in weeks, maybe months. There was always a reason why Sarah was eating separately, always an explanation that had seemed reasonable at the time, but now felt hollow and wrong. She doesn't eat with us very often, he admitted. Elena says it's better for Sarah to eat alone when she's being difficult, that making meals into battlegrounds isn't healthy for anyone. And you believed this was helping Sarah? Dr. Martinez asked, her tone carefully neutral. The question hung in the air, and David felt the ground shifting beneath him. He thought about Elena's confident explanations, her psychological terminology, her apparent expertise in childhood development. He thought about his own desperate gratitude for someone who seemed to understand his complicated daughter better than he did. After Linda's death, Sarah's grief had been overwhelming. She'd cried constantly, had nightmares, asked questions about death and heaven that David couldn't answer. Elena had brought order to the chaos, had offered solutions to problems that had left David feeling helpless and inadequate. But sitting in this sterile medical office, watching his daughter shrink into herself, David began to see the past 3 years through a different lens. Elena's solutions hadn't made Sara better. They had made her smaller, quieter, more compliant. He had mistaken his daughter's silence for healing, her withdrawal for acceptance. "I thought Elena was helping," he said quietly. "She seemed to know what to do. After Linda died, I was lost. Sara was so angry and sad, and I didn't know how to help her." Elena had ideas, strategies. She made it seem like Sara's behavior was normal for trauma recovery, and that consistency and structure would help her adjust. Dr. Martinez nodded, but there was something in her expression that made David's chest tighten further. "Mr. Chen, Sara has told us that she regularly goes days without eating because Elena withholds food as punishment. She's told us about locks on your refrigerator and cabinets that prevent her from accessing food or even water without Elena's permission. Are you aware of these restrictions?" The words hit David like a series of physical blows. He thought about the locks, about Elena's explanation that they were child-proofing measures to keep Sara safe from midnight snacking that could upset her stomach. He thought about Sara's empty lunchboxes, about Elena's explanation that Sara was on a special diet to help with her emotional eating. He thought about all the times he'd come home to find Sara in her room, being told she was thinking about her behavior or processing her feelings. "The locks," he said slowly. "Elena said they were to keep Sara from eating too much when we weren't watching. She said Sara had a problem with emotional eating, that she would binge when she was upset." Mrs. Patterson's expression remained professional, but David caught the flash of something darker in her eyes. "Mr. Chen, does Sara look to you like a child who eats too much?" For the first time, David really looked at his daughter, not through the lens of Elena's explanations or his own exhaustion, but with clear eyes. Sara's arms were thin as twigs where they emerged from her sleeves. Her face was gaunt, her eyes too large for her head, her clothes hanging loose on her small frame. She looked like the pictures of malnourished children from charity advertisements, not like a child who needed help controlling her eating. Realization crashed over him like a wave, bringing with it a crushing weight of guilt and horror. How had he not seen this? How had he allowed Elena's explanations to blind him to his own daughter's obvious physical deterioration? "Oh God," he whispered, reaching toward Sara, who flinched away from his touch. The flinch cut through him like a knife. When had his daughter started being afraid of him? When had he become someone she couldn't trust to protect her? "Chen, we need to discuss immediate steps to ensure Sara's safety," Mrs. Patterson said. "Based on what she's told us and based on her physical condition, we have serious concerns about her home environment." David's mind raced, trying to process the implications of what he was hearing. If Sara had been systematically starved, if Elena had been lying to him about Sara's eating habits, what else had she been lying about? He thought about all the times Sara had tried to talk to him, all the times she'd seemed to want to tell him something but had stopped herself. He thought about the way she'd grown quieter over the months, the way she'd stopped asking for things, the way she'd seemed to accept punishment for infractions he'd never witnessed. "What do I do?" he asked, his voice breaking. "How do I fix this?" "Doctor." Martinez stood up, her expression softening slightly. "The first step is acknowledging that there is a problem, which you've just done. The second step is ensuring Sara's immediate safety and beginning the process of addressing the abuse she's experienced." The word abuse hit David like a slap. Abuse happened to other people's children, to to kids whose parents were drug addicts or violent criminals, not to children in homes with two working parents and organized schedules and volunteer work at school. But as he looked at Sara's fragile form and thought about the systematic deprivation she'd described, he couldn't deny what it was. "Elena," he said suddenly. "I need to call Elena. She's expecting us home for lunch. She'll want to know what the doctor said." Mrs. Patterson and Dr. Martinez exchanged a look that David was learning to recognize. The look of professionals who had seen this before, who knew what came next. "Mr. Chen, I'm going to ask you not to contact Elena just yet," Mrs. Patterson said carefully. "We need to involve Child Protective Services, and it's important that we coordinate any communication with Elena to ensure Sara's safety." The mention of CPS sent a jolt of panic through David's system. In his mind, CPS was for other families, broken families, families where parents were obviously unfit. But as he looked at his daughter's hollow cheeks and remembered her flinch, when he'd reached for her, he began to understand that his family had become one of those families, that he had allowed it to become one of those families. "Will Sara be taken away from me?" he asked, his voice small and frightened. Dr. Martinez sat back down, her expression compassionate but serious. "That depends on several factors, Mr. Chen. Your willingness to cooperate, your commitment to Sara's safety, and your ability to ensure that the abuse stops immediately. The fact that you seem genuinely shocked by this information works in your favor, but actions matter more than intentions." Sara spoke for the first time since her father had returned to the room, her voice barely audible. "Daddy, I tried to tell you. I tried to tell you lots of times, but Elena said you wouldn't believe me because I'm a liar. She said you already thought I was too much trouble, and if I made more problems, you might give me away like you gave." "Away, Mom's things." The words hit David like physical blows. He remembered the weekend when Elena had convinced him to donate Linda's belongings to charity, how she'd framed it as healthy grief processing, a necessary step in moving forward. She'd suggested that keeping Linda's things was preventing both him and Sara from healing, that clinging to material objects was keeping them stuck in the past. Sara had cried when she'd discovered her mother's jewelry box was gone, along with Linda's favorite sweater that Sara had liked to sleep with when she had nightmares. Elena had been sympathetic but firm. "Healing requires letting go, sweetie. Your mom wouldn't want you to be sad forever." But now David realized that removing Linda's presence from their home had also removed Sara's connection to a mother who had never required her to earn love, who had never withheld food or affection as punishment, who had seen Sara as fundamentally worthy of care and protection. "Sara, honey, I'm so sorry," David said, his voice thick with tears he hadn't allowed himself to cry since Linda's funeral. "I should have listened. I should have seen. I should have protected you." Sara's own tears began to fall, not the quiet, careful tears she'd learned to cry in her bedroom where Elena couldn't see them, but the loud, messy sobs of a child who had finally been given permission to express her pain. Mrs. Patterson allowed them a moment before gently redirecting the conversation. "Mr. Chen, I need to ask you some specific questions about Elena's behavior. Has she ever discussed her methods of discipline with other family members or friends?" David thought about family gatherings, about the way Elena would casually mention Sara's eating issues or behavioral problems to his sister, to Linda's parents, to neighbors. She always spoke with such concern, such apparent devotion to helping Sara heal. His mother-in-law, Linda's mother Margaret, had even praised Elena for her patience with Sara's difficult phase. "She talks about Sara's problems with everyone," David said slowly. "She makes it sound like she's sacrificing so much to help Sara get better. People feel sorry for her, for having to deal with such a challenging stepdaughter." This realization brought another wave of nausea. Elena hadn't just isolated Sara within their family. She'd systematically destroyed Sara's reputation within their extended family and social circle. She'd painted herself as the martyred stepmother, dealing with an ungrateful, difficult child who didn't appreciate her efforts. What about Tommy? Dr. Martinez asked. How does Elena treat your son? David's heart sank as he realized the stark difference in Elena's treatment of the two children. Tommy was her biological son with her ex-husband, though Elena had full custody, and had moved him into David's house when they married. Elena doted on Tommy, praised his every accomplishment, showed off his school projects and athletic achievements. Tommy got special treats, extra privileges, and most importantly, regular meals without conditions or requirements. Tommy is her biological son, David said quietly. She treats him completely differently. He doesn't have rules about earning, food, or proving gratitude. He just gets to be a kid. Sarah's sobs grew louder at this acknowledgement. Of all the unfairness she'd endured, perhaps the most painful was watching Tommy receive the kind of unconditional love she remembered having with her own mother. Tommy got bedtime stories and surprise treats and comfort when he was sick. Tommy got to eat birthday cake and holiday cookies and second helpings at dinner. Tommy got to be a child. Has Tommy ever commented on the different treatment? Mrs. Patterson asked. David remembered Tommy's questions, his confusion about why Sara didn't eat with them anymore, why she spent so much time in her room, why she always looked sad. Elena's explanations to Tommy had been age-appropriate, but designed to maintain the fiction of Sara's problems. Sara was sick and needed special help. Sara was learning important lessons about gratitude. Sara was still sad about her first mommy and needed time to adjust. Tommy's asked questions, David said, but Elena always had explanations that seemed reasonable. She said Sara needed different rules because she was still grieving, still adjusting to our family. What David was beginning to understand was that Elena's explanations had been carefully crafted lies, designed to maintain her control while appearing reasonable to outside observers. She had weaponized Sara's grief, using her loss of Linda as justification for increasingly severe restrictions and punishments. Dr. Martinez made more notes, then looked directly at David. Mr. Chen, I need you to understand that what Elena has done to Sara constitutes serious abuse. Withholding food is a form of torture. The psychological manipulation, the isolation, the systematic destruction of Sara's self-worth, these are calculated acts of cruelty, not misguided attempts at discipline. The word torture made David's hands shake. He thought about Elena's calm explanations, her apparent expertise, her volunteer work at Sara's school. How could someone who seemed so caring, so invested in children's well-being, be capable of systematically starving a child? But she loves Sara, he said weakly, even as he heard how hollow the words sounded. She's always saying she loves her, that everything she does is to help Sara become a better person. Mrs. Patterson's expression was gentle but firm. Mr. Chen, love doesn't withhold basic necessities. Love doesn't require a child to earn food or water. What Elena has done to Sara isn't love. It's control. And Sara has been trapped in this situation for 3 years, unable to get help because the adults in her life believed Elena's version of events instead of seeing the evidence right in front of them. David looked at his daughter, really looked at her, and saw not just the physical evidence of starvation, but the emotional damage that had been done. Sara sat hunched over, making herself as small as possible, as if she were still trying to avoid drawing Elena's attention. Her eyes held a wariness that no 11-year-old should possess, a careful assessment of adult moods and intentions that spoke to months of walking on eggshells. What happens now? David asked again, though this time the question carried a different weight. He wasn't asking about procedures or protocols. He was asking how to begin undoing 3 years of damage, how to rebuild his daughter's trust, how to become the father she needed him to be. First, we ensure Sara's immediate safety, Mrs. Patterson said. That means Elena cannot be alone with Sara, and it means removing the locks and restrictions that have controlled Sara's access to food and water. It also means beginning the process of investigating what's happened and determining whether criminal charges are appropriate. The mention of criminal charges made David's head spin. Elena, who baked cookies for school fundraisers and volunteered at the library's reading program, might be facing jail time for what she'd done to Sara. The cognitive dissonance was overwhelming. How could someone who appeared so caring to the outside world be capable of such cruelty behind closed doors? "I don't know how to tell Tommy," David said suddenly. "He loves Elena. She's the only mother he's ever really known. How do I explain that the person who's been taking care of him has been hurting his sister?" This was another layer of Elena's careful manipulation. By treating Tommy with genuine love while abusing Sara, she had created a situation where any attempt to expose her behavior would necessarily involve hurting an innocent child who had no understanding of what was happening. To his stepsister, "Tommy will need support too," Dr. Martinez said gently. "Children are often more perceptive than adults realize. He may have noticed things he didn't understand or felt uncomfortable with differences he couldn't articulate. A family therapist, who specializes in abuse cases, can help both children process what's happened." Sara looked up at this mention of Tommy, and David saw guilt flash across her face. Even now, even after revealing the abuse she'd suffered, Sara was worried about the impact on her stepbrother. Elena had trained her to put everyone else's comfort ahead of her own needs, to feel responsible for maintaining family harmony even at the cost of her own well-being. "Sara, none of this is your fault," David said, reaching toward his daughter again. This time, she didn't flinch away, though her body remained tense. "What Elena did to you was wrong, and I was wrong not to see it. You don't have to protect anyone else right now. You just have to worry about getting better." Mrs. Patterson stood up, signaling a shift toward action. "Mr. Chen, I'm going to need you to call your workplace and arrange to take some time off. We're going to coordinate with the police and with Child Protective Services to ensure that when you return home, Sara's safety is the top priority. That may mean Elena needs to leave the house temporarily, or it may mean other living arrangements need to be made." The reality of what was about to happen hit David like a wave. In a few hours, their carefully constructed family life would be shattered. Elena would discover that her control over Sara had been exposed, that the careful narrative she'd built was crumbling. There would be investigations, interviews, legal proceedings. Tommy would be confused and frightened. Their extended family and friends would have to reconcile the Elena they thought they knew with the person who had systematically abused a child. But as David looked at his daughter, really saw her for the first time in months, he knew that no amount of disruption or discomfort could justify allowing the abuse to continue. Sara deserved to eat when she was hungry, to drink when she was thirsty, to sleep in peace without fear of punishment for imaginary infractions. She deserved to be a child. "Okay," David said, his voice stronger than it had been all morning. "What do we do first?" Dr. Martinez smiled, the first genuine smile David had seen from her during their conversation. "First, we get Sara something to eat. Real food, as much as she wants, with no conditions or requirements. And then we start the process of making sure she never has to earn her next meal again." Sara's eyes widened at the mention of food, and David saw hunger there, not just for calories, but for the simple dignity of being fed without having to beg or prove her worthiness. In that moment, he made a silent promise to his daughter and to Linda's memory that he would never again allow anyone to use Sara's basic needs as weapons against her. The road ahead would be difficult, full of legal proceedings and family therapy, and the slow work of rebuilding trust. But for the first time in 3 years, David felt like he was moving in the right direction, toward his daughter instead of away from her, toward truth instead of comfortable lies, toward becoming the father Sara had needed him to be all along. As Mrs. Patterson made phone calls, and Dr. Martinez arranged for Sara to be admitted to the hospital for observation and nutritional support, David sat beside his daughter and held her hand. It was small and cold, with fingernails bitten down to the quickened skin that felt too thin, but it was alive and warm and trusting enough to let him hold it. "I'm going to fix this," he told her quietly. "I don't know how yet, but I'm going to fix everything." Sara nodded, tears still streaming down her face, but for the first time in months, they weren't tears of despair. They were tears of relief, of hope, of a child who had finally been heard and believed and protected. In her free hand, she still clutched her mother's wooden butterfly, but now it felt less like a desperate lifeline and more like a promise kept. Linda's promise that Sara would remember how to be brave, especially when it mattered most. Outside, the examination room window, David could see storm clouds gathering over the city, but inside the small medical office, the long, dark winter of Sara's suffering was finally beginning to thaw. The police arrived at the Chen household at 2:17 p.m. on a Tuesday that would later be marked in Sara's memory as the day her life split into before and after, again. Officer Maria Santos and Detective James Richardson had coordinated with Mrs. Patterson to time their arrival for when Elena would be expecting David and Sara to return from the doctor's appointment. They needed to see the locks Sara had described, needed to document the evidence of systematic starvation before Elena had a chance to remove or explain away the physical proof of her abuse. Elena answered the door wearing the yellow sundress. That made her look younger than her 34 years. Her dark hair pulled back in a neat ponytail that suggested she'd been cleaning house while Sara and David were gone. Her smile was bright and welcoming until she registered the uniforms and badges, and then something shifted in her expression. Not quite fear, but a sharp calculation, as if she were rapidly assessing the situation and formulating her response. "Officers, is everything all right?" Elena's voice carried just the right note of concerned confusion, and she stepped back to invite them in while her eyes scanned the street to see if neighbors were watching. "Is this about David and Sara? They're at a doctor's appointment, but they should be home soon." "Actually, ma'am, this is about Sara," Detective Richardson said, his tone professional but not unkind. "We've had some concerns raised about her welfare, and we need to take a look around your home. Do we have your permission to enter?" Elena's hesitation lasted only a fraction of a second, but Officer Santos caught it. In her 12 years of police work, she'd learned to read the micro-expressions that revealed guilt, and Elena's momentary pause before agreeing spoke volumes. "Of course, whatever you need," Elena said, opening the door wider. "Though I'm not sure what kind of concerns. Sara's been struggling since her mother died, but we've been working with her therapist and her pediatrician. We're doing everything we can to help her heal." The house Elena led them into was picture perfect in the way that spoke of careful maintenance and pride of ownership. Family photos lined the mantelpiece, showing David and Elena's wedding, Tommy's soccer games, and carefully staged family portraits, where Sara stood slightly apart from the group, her smile never quite reaching her eyes. The living room was spotless, with toys neatly organized in bins and throw pillows arranged just so on the sectional sofa. "Beautiful home," Officer Santos commented, though her trained eyes were already cataloging details that might be relevant. "How long have you lived here?" 3 years, Elena replied, straightening a magazine on the coffee table. "David and I married not long after Linda, Sara's mother, passed away. The children needed stability, and David needed support. It's been challenging, blending families, especially with Sara's grief issues, but we've made it work." Detective Richardson had been taking notes, but at Elena's mention of Sara's grief issues, he looked up with renewed interest. "What kind of grief issues has Sara been experiencing?" Elena settled onto the sofa and gestured for the officers to sit as well, her body language open and cooperative. "Poor thing has just never really adjusted to losing her mother. She's been acting out, refusing to eat, being disrespectful, lying about things that never happened. Her therapist says it's normal for traumatized children to push against new authority figures, to test boundaries to see if they'll be abandoned again." Officer Santos nodded sympathetically, though she noticed that Elena had mentioned Sarah's eating issues without being directly asked about them. In her experience, guilty parties often volunteered information they were worried about, trying to control the narrative before uncomfortable questions arose. "Has Sarah been seeing her therapist regularly?" Detective Richardson asked. Elena's smile faltered almost imperceptibly. "We've had to take a break from therapy recently." Sarah was using the sessions to tell stories, elaborate fantasies about being mistreated at home. Her therapist felt that the sessions were reinforcing her tendency toward attention-seeking behavior rather than helping her process her grief healthily. This was a masterful lie, delivered with such sincerity that both officers might have believed it if they hadn't already spoken with Dr. Martinez and seen Sarah's medical records. The truth was that Elena had stopped taking Sarah to therapy 6 months after their first session, when the therapist had begun asking pointed questions about Sarah's home environment and expressing concern about her emotional state. "We'd like to see Sarah's bedroom, if that's all right," Officer Santos said, standing up. "And the kitchen as well." "Of course," Elena replied, though something tightened around her eyes. "Sarah's room is upstairs. She's been spending more time there lately." Her therapist recommended giving her space to process her emotions. As they climbed the stairs, Elena continued her narrative. "Sarah's always been a complicated child. Even before Linda died, she was moody, difficult to please. Linda spoiled her, I think, never required her to earn privileges or learn gratitude. When I came into the picture, I tried to provide more structure, more consistency. Some children thrive with gentle guidance, but Sarah needs firmer boundaries." Sarah's bedroom was small but neat, with a single bed pushed against one wall and a small desk where homework assignments sat in organized piles. Officer Santos noticed immediately that the room felt more like a cell than a child's sanctuary. There were no personal decorations, no posters on the walls, no scattered toys or books that would suggest a child actually lived and played there. "Sarah keeps her room very tidy," Elena said proudly. "We've been working on responsibility and taking care of her belongings. She's learned that privileges like decorating and personal items need to be earned through good behavior." Detective Richardson opened Sarah's closet and found clothes hanging in size order, everything perfectly organized but sparse. There were school uniforms, a few play outfits, and one nice dress that looked like it hadn't been worn in months. What struck him most was what wasn't there. No favorite stuffed animals visible, no collections of small treasures, none of the comfortable clutter that marked most children's spaces. "Where does Sarah keep her toys?" "Her books?" he asked. Elena's explanation came smoothly, as if she'd prepared for this question. "Sarah went through a destructive phase where she was breaking things when she got upset. We decided it was better to keep her special items in a safe place until she could demonstrate that she was ready for the responsibility. She can earn time with her toys through good behavior." Officer Santos found herself growing angry despite her professional training. The bedroom felt like a punishment in itself, sterile, controlled, designed to remind its occupant that comfort and joy were privileges that could be revoked at any time. She thought about her own daughter's chaotic bedroom, overflowing with art supplies and half-finished projects and beloved books read until their spines cracked, and felt sick imagining a child living in this carefully controlled environment. "Let's see the kitchen now," Detective Richardson said, his voice carefully neutral. Elena led them downstairs, her steps slightly quicker now, as if she were eager to get this inspection over with. The kitchen was as perfect as the rest of the house. Granite countertops gleaming, stainless steel appliances spotless, everything in its designated place. But Officer Santos's trained eye went immediately to the refrigerator and cabinets, where heavy-duty locks were clearly visible on multiple doors and drawers. "Can you tell us about these locks?" Detective Richardson asked, pulling out his phone to take photographs. Elena's explanation was ready, delivered with the same confident authority she'd used throughout their conversation. "Those are safety measures for Sarah. She's been having issues with binge eating when she's emotionally dysregulated, getting up in the middle of the night to gorge herself, then making herself sick with guilt. Her pediatrician recommended controlling her access to food until she could develop better self-regulation skills. Officer Santos walked closer to examine the locks, noting that they weren't the simple child-proof latches that might be used to keep toddlers out of dangerous areas. These were heavy-duty padlocks and combination locks, the kind used to secure storage units or protect valuable items from theft. These seem quite extensive, she observed. What exactly is locked up? Elena opened a few unlocked cabinets to show normal household items, dishes, cleaning supplies, cooking utensils. But when Officer Santos gestured toward the locked refrigerator, Elena hesitated. The refrigerator contains Sarah's trigger foods, Elena explained. Things that she tends to overeat when she's emotional. We found that limiting her access helps her make better choices during meals. Can you open it for us? Detective Richardson asked. Elena's hesitation was longer this time, and when she moved toward the refrigerator, her hands shook slightly as she worked the combination. Inside, the officers found what appeared to be a normally stocked family refrigerator. Milk, leftovers, fresh vegetables, sandwich meat, juice boxes. Nothing about the contents suggested food that needed to be locked away from a child with eating problems. This looks like regular food, Officer Santos observed. What specifically makes these items problematic for Sarah? Elena's explanation grew more elaborate, more desperate. It's not about the specific foods. It's about teaching her to ask permission, to check with adults before making food choices. Sarah has impulse control issues related to her trauma. The locks help her pause and think before acting on destructive urges. Detective Richardson was photographing everything now. The locks, the contents of the refrigerator, the sparse pantry shelves that Elena unlocked to reveal basic staples that any child should have been able to access for simple snacks. The evidence was damning, but Elena continued to spin her explanations with the confidence of someone who had been practicing them for months. Where does Tommy fit into these restrictions? Officer Santos asked. Does he have the same limited access to food? For the first time, Elena's composure cracked slightly. Tommy doesn't have the same issues that Sarah does. He's younger, and he hasn't experienced the same trauma. He doesn't need the same level of structure. So Tommy can access the refrigerator and cabinets freely, but Sarah cannot? Elena's voice grew defensive. Every child is different. What works for one child might not work for another. Sarah's needs are more complex. The officers exchanged a look that Elena caught, and her demeanor began to shift from cooperative to guarded. I'm not sure what you're implying, but everything we've done has been for Sarah's benefit. We love that child like our own, and we've been working tirelessly to help her heal from her mother's death. Where is Tommy now? Detective Richardson asked. At school, Elena replied. He'll be home on the bus in about an hour. Officer Santos made a note about timing. They would need to coordinate Tommy's return with Child Protective Services to ensure that the 8-year-old was protected from the chaos about to unfold in his home. Whatever Elena's crimes against Sarah, Tommy was an innocent victim who would need careful handling during the investigation. Elena's phone buzzed with a text message, and her face went pale as she read it. David says he's still at the doctor's office. They're running more tests. Is Sarah okay? Has something happened to her? The genuine concern in Elena's voice created another moment of cognitive dissonance for the officers. How could someone who appeared to love a child also systematically starve that same child? But Officer Santos had seen this pattern before. Abusers who genuinely believed their own narratives, who convinced themselves that their cruelty was actually kindness, that their control was actually care. Sarah is being thoroughly evaluated, Detective Richardson said carefully. We'll have more information soon. Elena's anxiety was becoming more visible now, her polished facade beginning to crack. I don't understand what's happening. We've been nothing but loving towards Sarah. Yes, She's required more structure than most children, but that's because of her trauma, her special needs. Everything we've done has been recommended by professionals." "Which professionals?" Officer Santos asked. "Can you provide us with names and contact information?" Elena's pause was longer this time, and when she spoke, her voice had lost some of its earlier confidence. "Her previous therapist, Dr. Chen, no relation to David, before we had to stop sessions. And her pediatrician has been aware of her eating issues, though we haven't discussed the specific interventions we've been using at home." Detective Richardson made notes, knowing that these healthcare providers would need to be contacted immediately. If Elena's claims were true, there would be documentation supporting her version of events. If they were lies, which the evidence strongly suggested, then Sarah's medical team would have crucial information about the real timeline and nature of her declining health. The sound of a car in the driveway made all three adults turn toward the window. Officer Santos saw a CPS vehicle pulling up, followed by David's truck. Elena saw the same vehicles and seemed to understand for the first time that this wasn't a routine welfare check or a misunderstanding that could be cleared up with reasonable explanations. "I want to call my lawyer," Elena said, her voice suddenly sharp and clear. "That's your right," Detective Richardson replied. "But first, we need to secure this scene and ensure the safety of all children involved." Elena watched through the window as David got out of his truck alone, his face grim and determined in a way she'd never seen before. Sara wasn't with him, and Elena's carefully constructed world began to tilt as she realized that whatever had happened at the doctor's office had changed everything. Mrs. Patterson approached the house with David, along with another CPS worker Elena didn't recognize. Through the window, Elena could see neighbors beginning to gather. Mrs. Kim from next door was standing in her front yard, and the Johnsons across the street had come out to watch the unusual parade of official vehicles. "Elena," David's voice called from the front porch, but it wasn't the David she knew. This voice was cold, formal, carrying an authority she'd never heard from her husband before. "We need to talk." Elena opened the door with hands that were no longer steady, and for the first time in 3 years, she found herself facing David without a carefully prepared explanation, without a reasonable narrative to justify what he'd discovered. The man, standing on her doorstep, was no longer the grief-stricken widower who had been grateful for her help with his difficult daughter. He was a father who had finally seen the truth, and Elena realized with growing horror that her carefully constructed empire of control was about to collapse entirely. Behind David, Mrs. Patterson carried a briefcase and wore the expression of someone who had documented evidence of serious crimes. Elena's mind raced through possible explanations, reasonable justifications, ways to frame Sarah's revelations as the fantasies of a troubled child. But as she looked at David's face and saw not confusion or uncertainty, but absolute determination, Elena began to understand that the time for explanations had passed. The truth, which Sara had carried in silence for so long, was finally demanding to be heard. The confrontation that followed would be seared into David's memory with the clarity that comes from moments when everything you thought you knew about your life reveals itself to be a carefully constructed lie. Elena stood in the doorway of their home, her yellow sundress and perfect ponytail now seeming like costume pieces in a play that was finally ending. And David saw her clearly for the first time since she'd entered their lives 3 years ago. "David, thank God you're home," Elena began, her voice carrying its familiar note of relief and concern. "These officers are here asking questions about Sara, saying there are concerns about her welfare. I've been trying to explain about her eating issues, her trauma responses, but I think there's been some kind of misunderstanding." David stepped into the house he had shared with this woman, this house where his daughter had been systematically starved while he worked 12-hour days and trusted Elena's expertise. The living room looked exactly as it always did, perfectly organized, welcoming, normal. But now he could see it differently, could imagine Sara sitting alone in this beautiful room while the rest of the family ate dinner in the kitchen, could Picture her watching through doorways as Tommy received the kind of unconditional care that should have been Sarah's birthright. "There's no misunderstanding," David said, his voice steadier than he felt. "Sarah told us everything, Elena. The locks, the withheld meals, the punishment for asking for water. All of it." Elena's face went through a series of micro-expressions: surprise, calculation, hurt, and then a kind of desperate confidence that David recognized as her default mode when challenged. She had always been able to talk her way out of difficult situations, to reframe conflicts in ways that made her the reasonable party and others the problem. "David, honey, you know how Sarah is," Elena said, stepping closer to him with the intimate tone she used when they were alone. "She's been telling stories since I came into her life, creating dramas and conflicts that don't exist. Remember when she claimed I threw away her mother's jewelry? We found it exactly where she'd hidden it, in her room. She has a pattern of creating narratives where she's the victim." Mrs. Patterson stepped forward, her professional demeanor calm but implacable. "Mrs. Chen, we've documented evidence of systematic food restriction and psychological abuse. Sarah's medical records support her account of chronic malnutrition. The locks on your refrigerator and cabinets are not therapeutic tools. They're instruments of control." Elena's laugh was bright and slightly desperate. Locks that were recommended? By Sarah's therapist for a child with binge-eating disorder. Restrictions that were suggested by her pediatrician for a girl who was making herself sick with emotional eating. "I have documentation of all of this." "Then you'll be able to provide that documentation," Detective Richardson said, stepping into the conversation. "Along with contact information for these healthcare providers who allegedly recommended starving a child as treatment." The word starving hit Elena like a slap, and her composure cracked visibly. "No one has been starved. That's ridiculous. Sarah eats every day. She's healthy, she's cared for, she's loved. Ask anyone who knows our family." David thought about all the people who would indeed vouch for Elena, his sister, who had praised Elena's patience with Sarah's difficult behavior, his in-laws, who had been grateful that David had found someone to help him manage his challenging daughter, the neighbors who saw Elena volunteering at school events and organizing neighborhood potlucks. Elena had been systematically building a reputation as a devoted stepmother, creating a public narrative that would make any accusations against her seem impossible. "Where is Sarah now?" Elena asked, looking between David and Mrs. Patterson. "Why? Isn't she with you? If there's nothing wrong, why isn't my daughter here?" The possessive pronoun hit David like a physical blow. "She's not your daughter," he said, his voice sharper than he intended. "She never was your daughter. A mother doesn't starve her child. A mother doesn't lock food away from a growing girl. A mother doesn't make a child beg for water." Elena's eyes filled with tears, and David felt a familiar tug of sympathy that he had to consciously resist. He had seen Elena cry before, had comforted her through moments of frustration with Sarah's behavior, had admired her commitment to helping his difficult daughter. But now he understood that those tears had been manipulative tools, designed to redirect his attention from Sarah's needs to Elena's emotional state. "I have loved that child like my own," Elena said, her voice breaking. "I have sacrificed everything to help her heal from her mother's death. I have endured her lies, her accusations, her attempts to turn you against me, and now she's finally succeeded." Mrs. Patterson pulled out a tablet and showed Elena photographs that had been taken at the hospital. "Mrs. Chen, this is what your love looks like. This is Sarah's weight chart over the past 3 years. This is the documentation of her malnutrition, her stunted growth, her physical deterioration under your care." Elena looked at the screen, and for a moment, David saw something flicker across her face that might have been genuine shock. Did she truly not realize how severely she had damaged Sarah? Had her ability to rationalize her behavior blinded her to the physical evidence of her abuse? "She's always been small," Elena said weakly. "She's naturally petite, like her mother was." Linda was 5'6" and healthy, David said, his voice flat. Sara is 11 years old and weighs 63 pounds. She weighs the same as she did when she was 8, Elena. She hasn't grown in 3 years because you've been starving her. The word hung in the air between them, impossible to rationalize or explain away. Elena's mouth opened and closed several times, as if she were searching for words that wouldn't come. For the first time since David had known her, Elena seemed to have no ready explanation, no reasonable narrative to offer. Officer Santos stepped closer to Elena, her hand resting casually near her handcuffs. "Mrs. Chen, we need you to come to the station for questioning. You have the right to remain silent and you have the right to an attorney." "You're arresting me." Elena's voice was high and sharp with disbelief. "For what? For trying to help a troubled child? For providing structure to a girl who had none after her mother died? For child abuse," Detective Richardson said simply. "For systematic starvation of a minor child. For psychological torture. For endangering the welfare of a child." Elena turned to David with the desperate look of someone whose world was collapsing. "David, you can't let them do this. You know me. You know I would never hurt Sara. Tell them about her behavior, her lies, her manipulation. Tell them how difficult she's been since I came into your lives." David looked at the woman he had married, the woman he had trusted with his daughter's life, and felt something fundamental shift inside him. The Elena standing before him, desperate, manipulative, still trying to control the narrative even as police officers prepared to arrest her, was finally visible to him without the filter of his own grief and gratitude. "No," David said quietly, his voice carrying a finality that made Elena step backward. "I won't tell them Sara is difficult. I won't tell them she's a liar, because the only difficult thing about Sara is that she survived what you did to her." Elena's face contorted with rage and disbelief. "You're choosing her over me? After everything I've done for this family? After how I've sacrificed for that ungrateful—" "Stop." David's voice cut through her words like a blade. "Don't say another word about my daughter. You've said enough." Officer Santos moved forward with the handcuffs, and Elena's composure finally shattered completely. "This is insane. I gave up my life to help you raise that child. I could have married anyone, David, anyone. But I chose to take on your broken family, your damaged daughter, and this is how you repay me?" The mask was fully off now, revealing the calculation that had always been beneath Elena's apparent devotion. David saw clearly how she had viewed Sara, not as a child to be loved, but as an obstacle to be controlled, a problem to be managed, a burden she had graciously agreed to shoulder. "You didn't take us on," David said as the handcuffs clicked into place around Elena's wrists. "You targeted us. You saw a grieving man and his vulnerable daughter, and you saw opportunity." Elena's lawyer would later argue that she had genuinely believed her methods were therapeutic, that she had been trying to help a troubled child develop discipline and gratitude. But David would always remember this moment when her true feelings about Sara emerged. The resentment, the entitlement, the cold calculation that had driven 3 years of systematic abuse. 6 months later, the rehabilitation center's dining room was bright and cheerful, with windows that looked out onto a garden where other children played under the supervision of trained therapists. Sara sat at a small table, slowly working her way through a peanut butter and jelly sandwich, her choice, made from a selection of options presented without conditions or requirements. Dr. Martinez sat across from her, not as a medical examiner, documenting abuse but as an ally in Sara's recovery. "How does it feel to eat when you're hungry?" she asked gently. Sara considered the question seriously, as she did most things now. 3 years of having to calculate the cost of every word, every gesture, every expression of need had taught her to think carefully before speaking. But therapy was slowly teaching her that some thoughts were safe to share. "Strange," Sara said. "Honestly, sometimes I still wait for someone to take it away." The physical recovery had been relatively straightforward. Sara's young body had responded quickly to adequate nutrition. and she had gained 12 pounds in 6 months. The psychological healing was more complex, requiring daily work to undo the patterns of hypervigilance and self-denial that Elena had systematically instilled. David visited every day, often bringing homework from Sara's new school or books she had requested from the library. He had taken a leave of absence from the automotive shop to focus entirely on Sara's recovery and his own process of understanding how he had failed to protect her. "I keep thinking I should have known," David told Dr. Chen, Sara's new therapist, during one of their family sessions. "How could I live in the same house and not see what was happening?" Dr. Chen, no relation to their family despite the shared surname, was a specialist in childhood trauma who had worked with other families torn apart by systematic abuse. Elena was very skilled at creating plausible explanations for concerning behaviors, she said gently. "She isolated Sara not just from food, but from your ability to see her clearly. That's how psychological manipulation works. It distorts reality gradually until abnormal situations feel normal." Tommy had been the most complicated victim of Elena's unraveling. At 8 years old, he couldn't understand why the mother who had loved him unconditionally was suddenly gone, why his home had been filled with police officers and social workers, why his sister was living somewhere else and his father cried at unexpected moments. The forensic interviews had revealed that Tommy had indeed noticed Elena's different treatment of Sara, but like most children, he had accepted adult explanations for things he didn't understand. Elena had told him that Sara needed special rules because she was still sad about her first mommy, and Tommy had accepted this as just another fact about his complicated family. Elena's trial had been swift and decisive. The physical evidence, the locks, the medical records, Sara's dramatic weight gain once removed from Elena's control, was impossible to dispute. Elena's defense team had tried to argue mental illness, claimed she had genuinely believed her. Methods were therapeutic, but the calculated nature of her abuse, her ability to present normally to outsiders while systematically torturing Sara, argued against any insanity defense. She had been sentenced to 8 years in prison for child abuse and endangerment. Tommy, now in the care of his biological father who had fought successfully for custody, visited her once a month. David hoped that someday Tommy would understand that loving Elena didn't mean condoning what she had done to Sara. 1 year later, Sara's new bedroom was chaos in the best possible way. Art supplies covered her desk, books were stacked on every surface, and her bed was surrounded by the comfortable clutter of a child who finally felt safe enough to make messes. The wooden butterfly her mother had given her sat on her nightstand, no longer a desperate talisman, but a gentle reminder of love that transcended death. She was 13 now, finally growing at a normal rate, her body catching up to the development that had been stunted by years of malnutrition. More importantly, she was learning to trust her own perceptions again, to believe that her memories were reliable, that her needs were valid. The hardest part hadn't been the physical recovery or even the therapy. The hardest part had been learning to accept that what had happened to her was real, that Elena's version of events had been lies, designed to keep Sara trapped and silent. For months, Sara had found herself second-guessing her own experiences, wondering if maybe she had been ungrateful. Maybe she had deserved the restrictions. Maybe Elena had really been trying to help. But Dr. Chen had been patient and persistent, helping Sara understand that children never deserve to be starved, that love doesn't require earning, that Elena's treatment of her had been a crime, not a misguided attempt at parenting. "I think about Tommy sometimes," Sara told her father one evening as they cooked dinner together, a simple pleasure that had taken months for Sara to enjoy without anxiety. "I wonder if he thinks I destroyed his family." David paused in his chopping of vegetables for their stir-fry. "You saved our family," he said firmly. "Elena destroyed Tommy's family when she chose to abuse you. You just finally found the courage to tell the truth about it." Tommy sent occasional letters through his father, awkward attempts at connection from a boy who was struggling to understand his own complicated feelings about the mother who had loved him, and the sister whose suffering that same mother had caused. Sara treasured these letters, hoping that someday they might rebuild their relationship without the toxic foundation Elena had created. The criminal case had been closed, but the civil litigation was ongoing. Elena's assets were being liquidated to pay for Sara's medical care and therapy, though no amount of money could truly compensate for 3 years of systematic abuse. David's lawyer had been clear that the financial settlement, while substantial, was less important than the legal acknowledgement that what had happened to Sara was a serious crime deserving of accountability. Most days now, Sara woke up hungry and went to the kitchen to make herself breakfast, a simple act that still felt revolutionary after years of having to earn every meal. She attended regular school, had made friends who knew nothing about her history, and was slowly learning to navigate the normal challenges of adolescence without the hyper-vigilance that trauma had instilled. The nightmares had mostly stopped. The startled response when adults raised their voices had faded. The automatic apology for taking up space had been replaced with a growing sense that she belonged in the world, that her presence was wanted, that love could exist without conditions. Onda. Quiet evenings, Sara would sometimes hold her mother's butterfly and remember Linda's words about courage. She understood now that courage wasn't the absence of fear. It was speaking truth in the face of terror, asking for help when help seemed impossible, choosing hope when despair felt safer. Sara had found her voice, and she was finally free to use it. Dr. Martinez filed her final report on Sara's case on a Tuesday afternoon, sitting in the same examination room where Sara had first broken her silence about Elena's abuse. The medical documentation told a story of systematic starvation and its aftermath. Weight charts that showed 3 years of arrested development, followed by steady, healthy growth, once adequate nutrition was restored. But the numbers couldn't capture the most important transformation: the return of light to a child's eyes, the emergence of laughter that wasn't careful or calculated, the development of trust in a girl who had learned to expect betrayal from the adults meant to protect her. Sara's case had prompted changes in Dr. Martinez's practice and in the broader medical community. New protocols were developed for screening childhood malnutrition, with particular attention to cases where psychological explanations for eating problems might mask systematic abuse. Elena's ability to manipulate medical professionals by using therapeutic language to justify cruelty had highlighted dangerous gaps in the system designed to protect vulnerable children. The locks that had secured the Chen family's refrigerator and cabinets now sat in an evidence locker, awaiting permanent destruction. They served as a reminder that abuse often hides behind reasonable explanations, that children's desperation for basic necessities can be reframed as behavioral problems by skilled manipulators. Sara's story became part of the training curriculum for social workers, pediatricians, and law enforcement officers who work with suspected abuse cases. Her courage in finally speaking her truth had not only saved her own life, but had contributed to a better understanding of how psychological abuse operates and how it can be more effectively identified and stopped. The butterfly still sat on Sara's nightstand, its carved wooden wings worn smooth by years of anxious handling. But now it served a different purpose, not as a lifeline in desperate circumstances, but as a reminder that even in the darkest times, the capacity for courage remains, waiting for the right moment to take flight. Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work. So if you are enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel.